What's up guys, Kellen back with Inside Out Precision, and today we've got kind of a shorter video in response to a question that we had from @PaulBuild on Instagram, and it had to do with when I was out practicing at the outdoor range the other day, and his question was where his focal point should be when he's aiming. So he tends to focus on his pin a little bit too much, and the target's a little bit blurry, and it just brought up in my opinion, a pretty good question as to what you should be focusing on when you're aiming. And really the answer is pretty simple. So you want to focus on the target, not your pin. So you've got a primary and a secondary focus in pretty much anything you do in life. One will be blurry, one will be a little more clear, and generally you want the target to be clear. So I want to be focused on the target and let the pin be in my secondary focus. So the reason for that is, well, there's two main reasons. The biggest one is that if I'm focused on my pin, there's a very wide focal point from my eye to my pin. I'm only aiming, 28 inches or 30 inches away. If I focus on the target, then my focal point narrows down to whatever distance it is I'm shooting. So then, if I'm shooting 20 yards, then I'm aiming 60 feet away instead of 3 feet right in front of my face. The other reason is that if I focus on my pin, and whether it's a pin or a dot on your scope or whatever it is, the spot that I'm aiming at tends to get blurry. And when that happens, especially if you're shooting like a 3D target where the lines aren't defined anyway, there's not a specific dot that you're aiming at, there's no color change, it makes it really, really hard to tell where my pin is relative to where I actually want to hit. I noticed that if I focus on my pin, the dot tends to look a little bit smaller and blurred, so the lines aren't crisp at all, they're a lot more blurred, and it may look like my pin is sitting well inside the dot, but then when I actually focus on the dot, I see that my pin is sitting at like 4 o'clock, barely inside the line. So it can be a little bit deceiving, where if you're focused on the pin, it looks like your pin is dead center. When it goes off, everything feels good, and you have these groups that are kind of all around the dot, even at just 20 yards. So when you're shooting, make sure you're focused on the target. When your pin or your dot covers what you're focused on and what you're staring at, that's when you start your release execution. If you're having trouble with this, especially if you're shooting a scope, you can try shooting a ring instead of a dot on your scope. I hear some guys say, they're staring at the target, and when their pin covers it, it's like their brain doesn't like not being able to see what they were staring at, so they actually will move that pin usually on the low side of the dot so they can still see what they're aiming at, and their pin isn't truly centered when it goes off. I actually know guys that have shot like that for a long time, and basically they just sight in all their marks to where they hit the center when their pin is actually, like let's say their dot on their scope, it just kind of borders the bottom of the dot that they're aiming at, and that's just how they shoot. I wouldn't recommend that way, but if it's something that over 10 years you've just built up and that's the way you shoot, that's okay. But if you shoot a ring, it's a little easier to center that target in your scope, because it's basically a series of concentric circles. You've got your peep sight, then your sight housing, and then the ring on your sight, and then you center the rings and the target in the ring on your sight. So your brain likes centering all those circles. So that can be a solution if you're shooting a scope. If you're shooting a pin, it can be a little challenging sometimes, especially if you're shooting a multiple pin, because not all the pins are centered. So it's something you just gotta work on. I would try starting again up really close. So start at 5 yards. So you can see the entire X-ring around your pin, and just kind of start building that mental image in your head and work your way back. And then when you get to 20, it's not this big giant jump. It's a little easier transition. So Paul, I hope that answers some of your questions. If you have any questions or comments, as always, feel free to comment below. Hit that subscribe button if you haven't already. And until next time, keep them in the middle.